I guess that's where the fake it till you make it phrase comes in, hey. But man, you can't fake till you make it in science. Hey there, Zesties! Another week, another episode here at the Gleeful Talk Show, where we share zesty stories to cultivate the happiness and hero within and out. Today's episode is a zesty story about a very high-profile case, and I actually picked this up only recently when a colleague at lunch was talking about a documentary in Disney+. Over lunch, my colleague mentioned a show detailing the rise and fall of a Silicon Valley CEO who has dropped out of a prestigious university, Stanford University, and built her own company from the ground up. She's basically a visionary and a genius in one. And I told her, hey, that sounds like the typical CEOs like Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg. And funny enough, the anti-hero of the show is a huge fan to the point obsessed with Steve Jobs, and more on that later. If you know what I'm talking about, yes, indeed, this episode is about the rise and fall of Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos. Now, there's a lot of content out there on the interwebs detailing about this case. There's a documentary on HBO, a movie, and there's also a book written by the actual journalist who uncovered the fraud, an ABC podcast about it, and recently the dramatized version of that podcast entitled Dropout from Disney, starring Amanda Seyfried. In this episode, I'm going to share the highlights of what transpired, background information not shown on the show, the facts and fiction that were shown on the Dropout show, where the case is currently at now, and of course my commentary. I hope this is not going to be too long, but if it will, I might cut it out in two parts if it becomes too long, so what do you think? Please be warned that there might be spoilers from the Dropout show, but if you're already across the whole story and just wanted my thoughts and recent news about it, feel free to continue. Now, where do I begin? Where do I begin? Okay. Elizabeth Holmes was born in Washington, D.C. on 1984. Her father was actually a vice president at Enron. Well, if you haven't come across the Enron scandal, I'll indulge you to it. This was all over our accounting textbooks back in the day, even in the Philippines. Enron was an energy company that later went bankrupt after an accounting fraud scandal. This was a total audit failure, and that's why your external auditors need to be independent of the company. So many accounting standards around that, but that will be for another day if you want an accountant's opinion about it. Anyway, it kind of gives you a bit of a preview that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Her mother worked as a congressional committee staffer, and her father later held executive positions in the government agencies such as USAID, the EPA, and USTDA. Her great-great-great-grandfather was Charles Louis Fleischmann. Not sure if I was pronouncing that right, but he was a Hungarian immigrant who founded the Fleischmann's Yeast Company. I was about to ask how did her last name become Holmes when her great-great-great-grandfather was a Fleischmann, but I realized a great-grandfather may have a child that is a girl. Oh my God, why are we talking about Elizabeth's family tree now? Clearly, she came from old money, and according to a family friend named Joseph Fuse, the parents were so proud of its yeast empire that may have yearned for the days of yore when the family was one of the richest in America. And Elizabeth channeled that at a young age. In high school, she was interested in computer programming and started her first business selling C++ compilers to Chinese universities. She was so brilliant that she began attending Stanford's summer Mandarin program. In 2002, she studied chemical engineering and worked as a student researcher and lab assistant at Stanford. At the end of her freshman year, She worked in a lab at the Genome Institute of Singapore and tested SARS through the collection of blood samples and syringes, filed her first patent on a wearable drug delivery patch the year after. I mean, clearly, this girl is driven, motivated, and very bright. I feel like she didn't have that much fun, though, at university and work her butt off all the time. Girl, have fun. My mom used to say to me, all work and no play makes you a dull girl. I took that to heart and played a lot, aka binge watching in the modern age. Anyway, in the show Dropout, it was depicted that Steve Jobs was her idol and she even had posters on her room with his face on it. Not sure how true the posters are, but man, I had Backstreet Boys and the Muppets posters in my room when I was young. Can't imagine the likes of Steve Jobs or Elon Musk to be on my walls, but to each her own. In March 2004, she dropped out of Stanford and used her tuition money as seed funding for a consumer healthcare tech company, again with reference to visionaries who dropped out of school like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg. I read or may have heard in a podcast some time ago that people are so obsessed with these outliers to the point that saying that education is not a measure of success. Like the likes of Steve Jobs and the gang on what they did by dropping out of school and creating a company. It's just that those are 1% or 0.01% of the population. You wouldn't hear too much of someone who have worked their ass off and did the straight path because people are more obsessed with the unicorns, not the horses. Don't know if I'm making the right analogy on that, but you get the gist, right? Now, don't quote me on the percentage there, Zesties, just trying to make a point. I still believe that education is the right choice, whether through university or self-education with the right resources. So, what I'm trying to say is, it's not that we are not going to be the next Steve Jobs. Perhaps a lot of us have potential, but dropping out of school like what Steve Jobs and the gang did would be more of a steeper path to success than going through college. Just saying. Or maybe it's just a Filipino in me that's always been embedded on my mind that education is something that couldn't be taken away from us, and that's why we strive for it. What do you think, Zesties? Not to mention that before quitting school, Elizabeth pitched her idea to Stanford professor Dr. Phyllis Gardner and told her that her idea wouldn't work given the current technology and processes, not to mention the actual science itself. Other professors told her the same, but she was so persistent and was able to convince her advisor and dean at the School of Engineering, Channing Robertson, to back her idea. In 2003, she founded the company Real Time Cures in Palo Alto, California to quote-unquote democratize healthcare. What does that even mean? Now, Elizabeth Holmes, being overly confident on her intellect and abilities with only over a year of studying chemical engineering, quit school to build a company that envisioned to provide accurate diagnosis over a single or few drops of blood. You know, I have a thing for overly confident yet inexperienced people. I don't know, they kind of throw me off. I can usually spot easily these people right away, so thank God. I am in disbelief how these people have an ounce of confidence if they are not knowing what they're doing. I guess that's where the fake it till you make it phrase comes in, hey. But man, you can't fake till you make it in science. You just can't fake it. You have to be methodical and data-driven. On the Dropout show, they have low-key depicted that Elizabeth read a lot of these self-help books for CEOs. So maybe that's where she got it from, or maybe she's just overly confident of her abilities, or maybe a combination of both. Who knows? You know how people get easily charmed from people who exude confidence? I think that's what mainly happened with her investors in the initial phase. Anyway, She then renamed the company Theranos, a combination of the words therapy and diagnosis. Excellent play of words. So, Channing Robertson, the dean who became her first board member and introduced Holmes to venture capitalists. There's a very long timeline for this, which was carefully crafted on the show Dropout. I will not go into details with this unless you want me to. Let me know in your comments or shoot me an email. Anyway, remember that she was studying Mandarin back then? During that time, she met a guy almost 20 years her senior at a trip to Beijing as part of Stanford's Mandarin program around 2002. She was 18 at that time and she had just graduated high school, while the guy named Ramesh Balwani, or Sunny for short, was 19 years older than her. So that's almost twice her age, isn't it? Sunny was a Pakistani-born Hindu who immigrated to India and then to the US. During that time, Balwani was married to another woman and magically they divorced the same year and became romantically involved with Holmes in 2003. The same time Holmes dropped out of university. Fishy, isn't it? You know how it is when you're a kid with wide eyes, very much eager to share your ideas with the world. You tend to be very idealistic due to your naivete. It's either Elizabeth dropped out of school because she wants to be the next Steve Jobs, or she was also somewhat influenced by Balwani, or maybe both. I guess we'll never know for sure. But the show Dropout did show that she was talking to Balwani during her years at Stanford and she found strength in him, especially when she got raped. This is another whole can of worms, Zesties. First of all, let's speculate on the dropping out of college. She was a massive fan of Steve Jobs. And I think what happened was that she was so obsessed to be like him that she dropped out of college as well because he dropped out of college. Talk about obsession to the highest level, right? And she actually literally mimicked him more and more down the line. More on that later. Also, when someone is intelligent, sometimes they think that they know everything in the world because they have a high IQ or somewhat. But the thing is, in science and medicine, it just doesn't work like that. Sure, it might work when you're on a business idea for a software or maybe new processes concerning industrial lines, etc. But medicine and science is a long game. And even with Elizabeth Holmes' high IQ, she couldn't recognize that because she's intelligent, right? So that's the downside of it. When you think too high of yourself and your feet is off the ground, you tend to also get dropped as low as you can be as well. So she might have thought, yeah, Facebook and Apple companies, they came from dropouts. I can be a dropout too and become the next Steve Jobs or the next big thing. But the thing is, again, medicine doesn't equal computers nor websites. So sure, her company is a medical technology company, but its building block is science and medicine. And you can't rush that. You are overturning decades and decades of research over 2 semesters at Stanford, and you think, everything already. Don't you think other medical technology companies would have already had that idea in the first place? And the elephant in the room, Zesties, the rape. In the show Dropout, she actually told her mother, but her mother advised her to shrug it off and move on. Now, that's not good. Parents should be there for their children. They should be guided well, most especially at a young age, and if not guided correctly, they get steered to the wrong path. Or otherwise, advised her to seek help with a medical professional for emotional and psychological support and trauma, or even fight for justice. But that never happened, it seemed like, and I guess this was also embedded on her mind. No justice, no sense of justice at all. So after that incident, she dropped out of school, asked her parents that she use her tuition money as seed funding for the company. Her company, later renamed Theranos, claimed to have a breakthrough health technology where their machines are able to perform hundreds of tests, supposedly over 240, ranging from cholesterol levels to complex genetic analysis with just a single drop of blood. Whereas existing technology require one vial of blood for each diagnostic test conducted. The company's wording on their website was later on reworded from a single drop of blood to a few drops of blood. When she was just starting building her company, one of the first people on her board of directors was her former advisor at Stanford, Channing Robertson, as I mentioned earlier, who was eventually paid around $500K for his role as consultant. He's practically there just to provide credibility to Theranos. Later on, Theranos' board was full of men who don't know any science, basically. George Shultz, a former Secretary of State, and he introduced a bunch of big names to the board, such as Richard Kovacevic, a former Wells Fargo and co-CEO, Jim Mattis, a former head of U.S. Central Command who later became the Defense Secretary, Gary Roughead, U.S. Navy officer, Sam Nunn, former U.S. Senator, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, William Perry, former Defense Secretary. There are a bunch more Zesties, but you know the gist. Did you notice there's no woman on the board? And one of the first women that Elizabeth initially approached to pitch her idea was Dr. Phyllis Gardner. Dr. Gardner, with her wealth of experience, was skeptical about the idea, and Elizabeth has taken it to an offense in a way that she thinks Dr. Gardner was just dismissing it because she's a woman. Now, this could be a reason why there's no woman on her board, but it could be something else too. What I'd say for sure is Elizabeth Holmes, being a young, blonde, white woman that she is quite charismatic. Even the writer at the Wall Street Journal, John Carreyrou, said this himself. So no wonder the men at the board would somehow get persuaded with this charismatic CEO who is just overselling and under-delivering the product, despite these men shelling out millions of dollars. No doubt she's a very intelligent woman, but intelligence without proper guidance can lead to dangerous things, and in this example, fraud. Even when Elizabeth was pitching it to different people, she was in a way saying that her technology works, but in reality, it's far from working. Even her team of scientists are telling her that it's just not possible yet with the current technology, with the current research, and they need more time. There have been a lot of instances that she lied, and if you read the book by John Carreyrou, the writer who exposed Theranos, as well as other materials out there, you'll know about the details of how she covered up her lies. But just to give you a taster, in Feb 2015, John Ioannidis, a Stanford professor, wrote in the Journal of American Medical Association that no peer-reviewed research from Theranos, which they claimed initially, had been published in medical research literature. In May 2015, another professor at the University of Toronto, Eleftherios Diamandis, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but yes, Eleftherios Diamandis analyzed Theranos tech and concluded that most of the company's claims are exaggerated. So Holmes, trying to bolster the company's credibility, invited then US VP Joe Biden to tour their facility. Wow, what an audacious and bold move. Take note, Zesties, that most members of her board were ex-government officials, so that's why it was so easy for the company to bring in government officials. And sometimes you kind of wonder, how does a board of directors in a medical technology company made up of government officials, not really scientists, right? Impressed by what he's seen, Biden praised the lab, not knowing that it's actually a makeshift lab, aka fake lab, that was built just for the purpose of his tour. In October 2015, John Carreyrou exposed Theranos through his article at the Wall Street Journal, the very newspaper that is owned by one of Theranos' board member, Rupert Murdoch. Now, that's what I call summoning the hero within, isn't it? There will be more heroic stories later, Zesties, which made this more interesting. In his article, Carreyrou exposed that Theranos was using traditional blood testing machines from third parties like Siemens instead of the company's Edison devices to run its tests because the Edison machine couldn't provide accurate results. As I mentioned earlier, these traditional devices need more volume of blood in order to accurately provide results, but since they only have a finger prick of blood, Theranos dilutes the blood samples in order for those traditional machines to accept it. But by doing this, it's also susceptible for inaccurate results. How did Carreyrou found this out? Because there have been a few people in the company who still has their integrity and heart in place. They couldn't fathom providing inaccurate results to people because can you imagine being provided an incorrect reading and taking meds because of those inaccurate reading? There have been patients who have noticed this and pathologists as well. There was an instance where I saw an interview of an actual patient who is actually a doctor who went to have his blood tested at a Theranos Wellness Center in Walgreens, and it turned out that he is pre-diabetic. And he is the type of person who goes to run every day, who has the physique, was like also looking not pre-diabetic, and his diet was good. He was quite surprised. So he did a secondary test from a different lab and he got the results where he wasn't even pre-diabetic. And if he would not have done this, he would have taken medicines to lower his blood sugar, etc. So can you imagine doing that, you know? So these few heroic people are Tyler Schultz, Erica Chung, and Adam Rosendorf. Schultz sounds familiar, isn't it? I kind of mentioned a similar surname earlier. Can you guess? Going once, going twice. Pink. Yes, Tyler Schultz is a relative of George Shultz, the former Secretary of State in the US. In fact, he is his grandson. He was a biology major at Stanford and came to work as an intern at Theranos through his grandfather, being a board member of the company. He was enthralled by Elizabeth's charisma. I mean, who wouldn't? After his internship, he accepted a full-time position as a research engineer, a stint that only lasted 8 months. He quit the day after he emailed Holmes in 2014 to alert her to failed quality control checks and other troubling practices within the company's clinical laboratory. He then received a blistering reply from then Theranos president and COO, Sunny Balwani, who belittled his grasp of basic mathematics and his knowledge of laboratory science. Take note, Zesties, Balwani doesn't even have any science training nor background. Ooh, the audacity. This is what I really don't like when people who don't have knowledge at all on the topic and act as if they know to the point of belittling the ones who actually knows. Anyway, it was clear as day that there was an open secret within Theranos that this technology simply didn't exist. Now, Erica Chung, on the other hand, is someone who is the complete opposite of Tyler Schultz's family. Before she got into Berkeley, she grew up in a one-bedroom trailer with her 6 family members. So when she got this job at Theranos, where initially she thought would have been her first and last company, considering how groundbreaking their quote-unquote commitment to revolutionize healthcare, she was blown away by how the company is handling the patient samples. She has a TED Talk out on YouTube. You can have a listen or you can watch it, where she summarized her journey of being a whistleblower at Theranos. When she was seeing how Theranos are treating the data, let alone the actual patient samples, she just had to speak up. So she has alerted the lab director, then the COO Balwani, but to no avail, she was dismissed for not really knowing quote unquote actual lab work. In the end, she quit Theranos and was contacted by John Carreyrou. But during this ordeal, she was threatened by Theranos in a lot of ways, and luckily, she had contacted a free lawyer who basically advised her to alert regulators about the Theranos labs. Imagine being a 20-something-year-old having to do this without enough resources and backup, but she did it anyway. She wrote a letter to the regulators, and this has prompted an investigation of the labs and resulted in Theranos not being able to operate their labs in 2 years. Then, slowly everything uncovered, and the rest is history. What an inspiring yet horrifying journey, I can imagine. It's quite glorifying to hear it now, but I bet when we are on their shoes a few years ago, it would be extremely nerve-wracking. It tells us that as long as we keep our integrity, our commitment to the truth and what's best to society and our communities, no matter how steep the road is, we will prevail, eventually. So, Zesties, I encourage you to keep that heroic fire burning inside you. So, how did the show Dropout portray the facts and fiction? How did the trial go? Where are the characters of this story now? More on that next week. If you Zesties enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, share, and review the podcast, whichever platform you're on. Share with your friends and fellow Zesties as well. Big thanks to our Zesties who keep on listening to the show every week and sending in their feedback, as well as those Zesties who are sending me my dose of caffeine of each month. If you guys would like to give me a cup of coffee or two, please head down to the episode notes to find out how. I'll see you next week for part 2.